Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Wampum family, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. So throughout our show thus far, we've referenced writers like Jamaica's Miss Lou to Trinidad's V.S. Naipaul, but more generally, our literature has had an immense impact on our culture. And in line with Caribbean Heritage Month, you can also follow countless readers online via the hashtag ReadCaribbean, which was started by bookstagrammer Cindy Allman, or Book of Sins, CINZ, in 2019. So this episode, of course, we are talking about literature. And I could not do this episode without inviting my friend, my good girl, Desiree Bailey. So literature has had an immense impact on our histories. And so, of course, had to have Desiree to talk with us today, especially about her new book of poetry, What Noise Against the Cane. So Desiree, I will turn it over to you and allow you to introduce yourself, tell us more about what you do, where in the Caribbean is near and dear to your heart.
Thank you, Alex, so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking with you today. And first of all, the place in the Caribbean that's near and dear to my heart is Faizabad, Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I grew up. There are other places in Trinidad that are near and dear to me, but I always need to shout out Faizabad first. And, it's also interesting thinking about the Caribbean as a place where where there's so much movement. So there are there's Grenada, there's Barbados in my history, but Trinidad is home for me. And so, as Alex, as you just said, I just wrote, or not just wrote, but my book, What Noise Against the Cane, just came out a few months ago. And I'm a writer, I'm a poet, I'm a teacher, I am a lover of the Caribbean, and I'm really excited to be here.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I'll first start by asking you, how did you get interested in writing and poetry?
I think, honestly, I've always, and people always say this, right, that they've been writing for as long as they can remember. And I have a similar story, but I think I really started to become interested in it, deeply interested, when I moved to New York with my family. And for me, my story of immigration is really wrapped up with my writing and with my self expression, because it was a time where I had to sort of find myself again and my footing. And I moved at a very young age, but I didn't realize at the time that that movement, that migration really impacted me in the way that it did. I think I'm still sort of unpacking that. And so writing was a way for me to remember home, to remember where I came from, and also to figure out and see where I was going. And so, I really latched on to anything that I could in school. But it wasn't until I got into college where I took a Caribbean poetry class with Professor Mark McMorris, who's also a poet. And so he introduced me to Amy Césaire, to Brathwaite, to Honor Bessie Phillip. And so it was the first time I really saw our literature in text in this way and in a course. I also had another professor who introduced us to Audre Lorde, and we read Zami, a new spelling of my name. And that really just, that blew so much open for me, because I really wasn't prepared for that story in so many ways, actually. But the references to the Caribbean, to Barbados and also Grenada, I really identified with that. And so it was a way for me to really to see our works as something worthy of being studied, and as something that we can do and recreate and replicate and aspire to.
You were dropping names already. I'm like, wait, hold on. Let me. I'm like, yes, well, yes, Lord. I'm an immense Audre Lorde stan. So I agree. But I mean, I think even for me, when I think of my journey into understanding Caribbean history, it was through novels first, right? Through novels, through works of fiction, through poetry first, before I even got to like some of these big textbooks or, quote unquote historical text, right? Like I think of maybe Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, right? As one of them that I read as a teenager. And I was like, I'm learning about Caribbean history through this book, right? Through this novel that's sort of like a autobiography. I mean, I think she's a brilliant writer that we would need another podcast episode to do
Listen,
that.
listen.
Yes.
Really, we need to talk about Jamaica Kincaid. That, the brilliance. I'm so happy
Mm-hmm.
that you mentioned A Small Place, because and that you were reading A Small Place as a teenager. That's really impressive. And for me, I actually recently came to A Small Place, and I was really energized by her clarity in that
Mm-hmm.
work and how she describes really the colonialism that's inherent in tourism,
Mm-hmm.
and just laying that out in a way that is so easily understood,
Understood.
but yes, but not leaving anything out. And so, Kincaid is a huge hero of mine, someone that I wish I had read earlier. And I don't know why I didn't, because I definitely saw her books at the library, but maybe I just felt like I wasn't ready. So Annie John is actually
Mm-hmm.
a book that I've taught recently. And again, I think what blows me away about that text is how, again, she addresses this problem of colonialism and colonization, but not in a way that feels pedantic or preachy. She's really showing it to you through the lived experience of
Mm-hmm.
this young girl, of Annie. And there's a scene where Annie is always really rebellious, and she's dancing on like the tombstones of their masters in her underwear. I'm like, what? Like, who writes this? This is amazing, you
Yeah.
know? And so again, yes, we can talk about Kincaid all day, but I'm really just blown away by the weaving in, how seamless those critiques are, and
Mm-hmm.
that the craft is never sacrificed.
Wonderfully said. I mean, thinking of Kincaid, whether you're thinking of, George Lamming, another writer, his book In the Castle of My Skin, or Samuel Selvin, The Lonely Londoners, there are so many we could even talk about, even going back beyond. So those are books, what, maybe 50s or their 60s, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
But even well before that, Mary Prince's autobiography. So she was an enslaved woman born in Bermuda, and her autobiography was published in 1831. And, just really accounting firsthand for revealing the truths of West Indian slavery through her book, right? And so,
Yes.
could you talk a bit about what are some of the common themes you have in mind when you think of Caribbean literature and how it has affected and influenced our history, and even your own understanding of our history?
Mm, I love this question, because actually what draws me to our literature is its multitudes. It's so diverse. There are so many questions. But you're right, there are these salient themes that connect so many of these works. And one of the things that I think about with Caribbean literature is the layering of language and languages. And so we have the standardized forms of whether it's English or Spanish, or, the colonial languages.
Mm-hmm.
I love the air quotes that you just
Yes.
did.
I have my
Exactly.
languages episode because I was like,
Exactly.
we're not calling our languages broken, or anyways,
No,
carry on.
no, broken where? And so So we have the texts that are completely in the what's recognized as the standardized like colonial languages. Then we have, I guess, we can call it the nation languages or the more localized languages, however you would like to describe it, the patois, the creoles, and the different registers within that alone.
Mm-hmm.
And even I think whether it's an island, a nation, a territory, within that space, let's just think about Trinidad alone, right? You have so many different ways of speaking that are all Trinidadian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always marveling at that. And that multiplicity shows up in the work. It shows up in the work across different languages, across different parts of the Caribbean. And so that's something that I think I see in a lot of the different texts. And I'm also thinking about a sense of the polyvocality, which I think is what we're talking about, these many different voices that really are coming out of our history
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with, again, colonialism, neocolonialism, slavery, indentured labor, of course, the genocide of indigenous peoples as well. And so I see that layering really, I want to say as a response, but response doesn't really capture all that I want to say, you know, is a mechanism of survival, but also of how we express ourselves, how we need to speak, and how we need to maneuver as well.
Mm-hmm. I also think of, which I mean is probably going to propel us into your book, but our relationship to land, right? And home.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
how for many of us, you and I are daughters of the diaspora in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so how living, and I think this is a trajectory I've seen across a number of books, especially Caribbean women's literature, what it means to move away from the Caribbean, right? And still want to hold ties to a place that very much so seems like home. So how have you seen that theme manifest, and how has it manifested in your own work?
Yeah. Again, home is something that I will always come back to, the sense of belonging. I think about what Noise Against the Cane as a quest for belonging and trying to work through what my place is and where my place is in the world. I think those of us who are in diaspora, whether we are immigrants ourselves or whether we are first generation, sometimes we are sort of confronted with this question of where is home, and also these questions of authenticity, which I hate. And I feel it's almost in every poem in some way. And years ago, I was thinking of, or I was listening to the poet Natalie Diaz, and she was talking about how there are some themes and questions that she will forever be writing about. And so I feel that with this sense of home and belonging. And so even the part of the text that is not autobiographical or that speaks directly to my experience. So the poems that are set during the Haitian Revolution, that question of longing for a place that you may never see again
Mm-hmm.
is incredibly salient in that work. And so I think my own experiences sort of inform that imagining and that question. But I also love that in your question, you also brought up this question of land. And when I was thinking about what I think is common in a lot of Caribbean works, I thought about the ecological and the landscape and how it's very hard to ignore the land that we are
Mm-hmm.
on, the land that we come from. It's hard to ignore the ocean, to ignore the various birds, the sounds. And it's something that I'm quite proud of, that so much of Caribbean writing has this reverence for the land, this respect for the land, which sometimes runs parallel to the question of home and belonging. But I think it also diverges as well.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. I mean, First off, I cannot we're jumping into What Noise Against the Cane, so I cannot bring up the book without talking about how like beautiful, Desiree, you did a an amazing job. I mean, anything, whether it's the cover art, whether it is sea voice running across I was just like,
Thank
you
you. Thank
oh, of
you.
course. You weave history and memory, though, throughout a lot of your poems, as we've talked about, right? So, can you share what your own sort of intimate connection is and what inspired this trajectory or this theme, especially in your poem, Chant for the Waters and Dirt and Blade?
Mhm. Ooh. With memory, I think it's very layered because, as I said earlier, immigration has impacted my life, my trajectory in a way that I'm still trying to understand. But on top of that, there is also the migration of my grandfather on my mom's side, who came to Trinidad as a boy from Grenada. So he used to work in the cocoa fields in Grenada and then moved to Trinidad and always had a Grenadian accent. And I didn't know that. I just thought that was his way of speaking. And then also on my dad's side, his family coming to Trinidad I think, at the beginning of the 1900s from Barbados. And I think my interest in memory and in this kind of history and oral storytelling, I don't know, I think came from listening to my elders, also talking with my aunts, who I think of as the family historian as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so just spending time listening to the knowledges that they possess and that they pass on. And then also learning that we have narratives of slavery, not a narrative that I have read of in a textbook, but a narrative that has been passed down.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me realize that actually slavery was not that long ago, as many would like us to believe. If I can really trace back a few family members,
Yeah.
and if I can name this person who went through this experience, then really this actually just happened.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still in, I guess, the afterlife of it in many ways. So I think really just being present with family members and listening to them is really what sparked that exploration. And I would also say an obsession, you
Mm.
know?
Me
Yeah.
too. Very much so. I think I remember as a kid being like, okay, mom, okay, and grandma, and like trying to do this was before I was like, oh, I could actually like write down a family tree, but very much so like wanting to know the stories and this background, right? Especially for like, I have relatives who don't even have, I don't want to say actual markings, but back colonial times, right? Don't know what their birthdays are and all of these things, and their stories and our histories come through that, right? So what you said, I find so profound because I think it echoes my life in so many ways as well. But I want to talk about your poem Chant for the Waters and Dirt and Blade.
Yes,
Yes, tell us the things, the thoughts.
yes, the things, the thoughts. So with that poem, where do I begin with that poem? Really, because I've been working on it for so many years. And there are pieces of it that I don't even know where those pieces are anymore. That it didn't make the cut, but it's a piece that I've been living with and growing with for a while. And of course, the ocean, you cannot miss the ocean within that piece. And so part of that, so I grew up in Trinidad. I spent a lot of time near the ocean. And so the ocean really represents memory and history for me. And so I think it had to be there and wanted to be there. I couldn't really ignore it. And I think also with this piece, one of the things that I think we often bump up against when we start to study our history and in a very like lived way, and when we start to think about, well, How did our ancestors think about the world? How did they think about life and death and after, all of that? Is that we encounter the anti Blackness that has been passed down through the violence of slavery, really. The anti Blackness in response to those religions and ways of worshiping. And so, also within this poem, and really, I think the entire book, is this aspect of me wrestling with that and trying to find ways of honoring African religions and spiritualities and philosophies that I've seen growing
Mhm.
up and that I'm continuing to learn more about, that are sometimes rejected largely. And so I will often say that I'm questioning, that I'm exploring, because I really believe that for me, in this poem, there is that exploration. There isn't necessarily a definitive argument, although some people may say that there is a strong argument and a case for it. But I think the work of me writing it, I wanted to understand, well, how do you even how do you decide to resist? How do you decide to put your life on the line to make the sacrifice for your freedom? What sort of propels you to that space? And I was also thinking about and learning about the centrality of Haitian voodoo in the Haitian Revolution.
Mhm.
And to me, I felt that this was an incredible way to sort of get a glimpse into those questions that I just asked, the how, right? The driving force behind that. It's not the only thing, of course, but I think I wanted to approach it from an aspect of spirituality and also what was happening inside the mind.
Mhm. And that resistance like looks differently, right? And I think we've talked about this before in the podcast, right? But as much as we want to champion those big, quote unquote, big revolutions, right? Revolutionary work, revolutionary actions could be in the deciding not to work in the fields. That poem to me, which is like multi-layered, the way that you're able to capture inner thoughts of, wanting to revolt, what revolution looks like, can look like, did look like, and what it means for our people in a way that, doesn't show up necessarily in the books that we read, certainly
Mm,
not in like your, typical high school textbook or whatever for sure, but
yeah, I didn't want to arrive at a place of, well, okay, I'm gonna, pick up my cutlass. And I felt that it had to have been a difficult decision. And of course, now I'm talking about what we might call like the big revolution,
mhm,
But I wanted to sort of capture a kind of back and forth, again, the questioning. But also, I was really interested in those small resistances and how important those are. And so the decision to have an abortion, to use the knowledge of plants and the medicines
mhm,
that were available at the time to enslaved women, to decide I'm not going to contribute to the sale of
mhm,
beings and to the production in that way. And how the womb, I don't want to be like essentializing here when I say this, but in a way, like, we can think about the womb as a site of rebellion, deciding, I mean, in terms of whatever actions were taken, right?
mhm,
So the decision to carry on life, I think, is also an act of resistance. But the decision to say, well, not now or never,
mhm,
that's also in that context
mhm.
where, your very body was property. Come on,
Mhm.
And so I really wanted to make that part of the narrative there.
A number of the speakers in your poetry are, if they are identified, they're women. right? So this could be
Mhm.
that poem, it could be the Harriet Jacobs Grips the Silence piece. So why have women's perspectives been an important focal point of your writing, and what have other women writers done for your understanding of self and self history?
I think I actually don't even think I intended it to
Mm,
be so, so woman centered and centric. And obviously it's there. So I think it had to be there. And I've definitely seen it within our communities, although, and this is the kind of paradox, although there's a championing of women and the strength of women and the leaders of the household, and right there is also in many ways a suppression of women and our voices and our agency. And so I've definitely felt that growing up, and I've felt that in our communities. And so I think it's something that I had to address, whether I wanted to or not, because sometimes I can be a bit nervous, talk about things in the work, and then after I'm done with it, I'm like, well, oh shit, like I guess it's there.
yep.
So I think it really came out of a place of necessity, really. Like it had to be there, and it found its way in. And again, I think of Audre Lorde, who I think people really forget the Caribbean
Mm-hmm.
connection there. So that's why I want to bring her into this space that's about Caribbean literature and thinking about Zami, but also Sister Outside, and that collection. I've been really inspired by those essays, thinking that there's a place for my anger, there's a place for my, length and depth and breadth of my emotions, that I'm not only afforded just one or a simple binary of
Mm-hmm.
emotions. That has been incredibly empowering to me. I'm thinking about Bessie Phillips, and especially how words she tries her tongue, her silence softly breaks. Ooh, just the title alone, and again, questions of mother-daughter relationships, or again, the layering of languages.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm going to bring Kincaid in here because of the way in which she discusses what it's like to be in an oppressed place and to be an oppressed person, but not really running to an idea of a nation or a nation state as the solution, and in some ways sort of disrupting that and troubling that and finding more localized ways of expression and resistance. So I've been incredibly, I don't know, I just feel like there's so many, there's Dion Brand,
Mm-hmm.
there's a contemporary, well, I guess all these people, well, Dion Brand and Kincaid, they're contemporary, right? But Shivani Ramlokan in Trinidad, Rising Out of Trinidad, also I think does this beautifully and with such force and fire. So many people to me, which inspires me, that abundance that I can sit here and list names all day and
Mm-hmm.
I still won't like capture the full of it.
And the fact that it's sort of empowering too, right? To I think in reading Kincaid and reading other, especially Black women writers generally, for me, I was like, oh, I can write my own stories, right? Especially when you're talking about this dynamic of being at times, very exalted but also very suppressed emotionally, who we are, especially as Black women, as Black Caribbean women. Yeah, I don't
Mhm.
know, to be
Mhm.
able to write my own stories, to speak my thoughts, to theorize how I see the world because of that guidance from so many of the writers who we talked about in this episode, I think has been really instrumental for me.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And like, how lucky are we that we have them as
Very true.
guides, and that we are also alongside so many peers so many contemporaries who are doing this work with us, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and who are sort of pushing forth and imagining and building Caribbean futures, you know. Like as I say Caribbean futures, I'm also thinking of the poet Ariel John. Sorry that I'm mentioning so many Trinis right now, but who like specifically talks about this idea of the Caribbean future and really working towards that. So I just feel lucky to be in this
Mm-hmm.
tradition.
Beautifully, beautifully said. Another thing, which is sort of parallel, one of my favorite poems before I even knew that this was going to be in the book because it was published before the book, is Woman
Mm.
in Dub, which
Ah.
I love for so many reasons. I'm gonna have to link the poets.org piece in our show notes and stuff because you guys need to listen to Desiree read this poem. It's one thing to read the text in the book, but when she reads it aloud, I was like, okay. I was like, all right, Desiree, put us all in our place. Thank you. Thank you.
Ooh.
So firstly, I will ask, what connection have you made and have you read about between our writing and music?
Yeah, so well, let me start with that piece because it's very clear that it's inspired by both dub music, also dub poetry, and with that poem Woman in Dub, I really wanted to see if I could even try to recreate the structures of dub music in a very literal way. So the
Mm-hmm.
reverb, the echoes, and you know, I think the question of okay, was I successful or not is less important, but the journey of me getting there. I don't know. It was an astounding experience. I had a lot of fun writing it, actually, even
Mm-hmm.
though some people may think it's a heavy poem, but the process of it was really playful. And it's okay, poems are heavy, they're poems,
Yeah.
right? So dub music is definitely really informative for me. Also, and of course, I'm gonna name the Caribbean art forms: soca, calypso, the way in which we tell stories through music. I think is really important to me. And while writing this book, I was also thinking of Calypso Rose
Mm-hmm.
and how she talks about often the plight of women, but also like the triumphs of women in her music, and also about how much force she had to bring to really like make it in as a woman in the calypso scene. And so all of that I was thinking about. Hip hop I think is also in these poems as
Mm-hmm.
well. um and even when I write poems I have to speak them at some point in the process. I have to speak them, which is why I don't like to write in public spaces because I'm like people gonna be like, what's going on here? So I have to like be on my own. But really, that's because music is really such a huge part of the process for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you guys have to check out that poem. It's one of my absolute faves from Desiree. So yes.
Yay.
We've given so many, I feel like we've given my favorite question that everybody knows on the podcast is like, what are your favorite cultural works? And I know we've given a number already, but what are sort of your must read or must listen to or must watch pieces of Caribbean culture that, reflect history, reflect literature, etc.?
So, favorite again, she tries her tongue, her silence softly breaks. That's a big one for
Mhm,
me in how I think innovative it is. There's a playfulness with the language, even though it is very serious.
mhm,
And so I'm always drawn to works that are riffing and that have a sense of experimentation in there. And so that's definitely one I would say, please, go out, read that for sure. I think it doesn't try to again come from this sense of I'm going to describe the situation of the nation. But here is my experience. Here are these
Mm-hmm.
experiences, I think, in a much more intimate way. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely one that I would recommend.
Definitely. Oyago. Stay tuned for Strictly Facts Sounds, where we connect our history to pop culture. For this Strictly Facts Sounds, we're bringing back Desiree's selection, a Strictly Facts fave, M. Narbesi Phillips' poetry collection, She Tries Her Tongue, which, originally published in 1988, discusses themes like language and colonialism, which are integral pieces of our literature and history. She Tries Her Tongue earned Phillip the Casa de las Americas Prize, making her the first Anglophone woman and second Canadian to win such a prestigious literary award. Next up, before you check out Desiree's poem Woman in Dub, listen to Lee Scratch Perry and Max Romeo's 1976 dub classic Chase the Devil, which combines the importance of music and writing for our upliftment, as Romeo has said, is a song about casting all negative thoughts out of our minds. And lastly, as promised, listen to Desiree's reading of Woman in Dub online at poets.org. She not only pays tribute to musical geniuses like Perry and Romeo, but she also beautifully celebrates women's voices and experiences in our society. Well, tell us what's next, because I'm like, when's the next book dropping? I know I'm crazy, but
Well, let me just say, because I've been like saying this to people to remind myself that I'm working on resisting the productivity,
mm-hmm.
that work ethic
Mm-hmm.
that's often required of us. I'm working on resisting the what's thought of as the immigrant work ethic, but
Yes, because
also
we always have 3 jobs at any point in time, very much so.
listen, we have to unlearn that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, again, it comes from a place of necessity
Yeah.
too. So I don't mean to knock it. So I'm doing that, which is a lot of work, as I'm realizing. But also, I'm reading and I am tinkering with something new. So yeah, that's what's coming up.
Well, thank you so much, Desiree, for being here with us. Thank you all our listeners for tuning in. Let us know, Desiree, on where on social media to find you, and of course, where we can pick up What Noise Against the Cane.
Yes, thank you, Alex, for having me. What Noise Against the Cane is in so many places, but I would say order it through your local bookstore if it's not already there. I think that's the best way. Support your local booksellers. And you can follow me on Instagram at Desiree Carla and on Twitter, Desiree C. Bailey.
Perfect. Well, yes, definitely make sure to grab What Noise Against the Cane, everyone. It's an amazing, amazing book. I'll have links to it in their show notes, of course. I hope you enjoyed this episode, everyone. Be sure to enjoy the rest of Caribbean American Heritage Month. Read Caribbean, which means also read What Noise Against the Cane. And little more, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.